The idea of having a 5-year plan to control economic activity was the brainchild of the Soviet Union, kicking off the world's first 5-year plan almost 100 years ago, in the late 1920s, which was the first of 13 adopted by the Soviets. This revolution from above, as it was called, was deemed so successful that the first 5-year plan was completed in just 4, so some would say the first actual 5-year plan was actually the second one, but that's just trivia. But were they actually a success? How did they operate? Why did they stop? And why have prominent figures like Alibaba's Jack Ma suggested artificial intelligence could lead to planned economies in the future? These are some of the questions we're going to be looking at in this video. But before that, if you're interested in finding the answers to questions like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Now back to the video. To really understand the whole idea of 5-year economic plans, you have to understand the economic environment they were initially intended to work within, by which we mean command economies. So what are command economies? Simply put, they are economies which operate under significant control by the country's government. Their goal is for government, not private enterprise, to manage the nation's economy. Such a management style is why they're also known as planned economies. As the name suggests, everything from what factories will produce to what you will consume and at what cost are planned to a large degree by government representatives. Lucky for us, economic history is absolutely full of examples of planned economies, including the Soviet Union and Maoist China, alongside modern-day North Korea and Cuba, all communist countries whose economic models of limited private ownership facilitate such a system. If done right, and there is a big if here, then advocates argue that a command economy offers certain benefits. These include a focus on societal welfare, a key feature in 5-year plans, alongside a reduction in unemployment, and ideally an assurance that all citizens have access to basic needs. On the flip side though, even when done right, command economies, and by extension the 5-year plans used to implement them, are plagued with problems. These will become evident throughout the video, but include the incredibly difficult task planners have of guessing where equilibrium between demand and supply lies, which often leads to shortages or gluts of goods. The inefficiency associated with this, not to mention the high levels of bureaucracy and the truly horrendous human costs to achieve plan objectives. So, let's look at an example of a 5-year plan, using the Soviet Union as an example. As mentioned in the intro to this video, the first use of a 5-year plan was undertaken by the Soviet Union in 1928. In total, it produced 13 plans over its lifespan. Something all of these plans had in common was to set headline-grabbing objectives. For example, the first plan had 2 overarching goals for Soviet domestic policy: rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. As with later plans, these were backed up by a series of more quantifiable outcomes, including doubling the country's real national income in 5 years, trebling investment, and for consumption per head to rise by 2/3. That's all very well, but why adopt a 5-year plan? Why not a 7 or a 3-year plan? Well, in addition to liking multiples of 5, plan periods were 5 years for 2 main reasons. Firstly, they theoretically allowed enough time for the completion of major projects, such as the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and secondly, 5-year plans would smooth out harvest fluctuations. This focus on harvests was due to the emphasis of farm collectivization and agriculture's dominance in many command economies. So how did the early 5-year plans perform then? As highlighted, the success of the 5-year plans was often measured and hinged on achieving certain goals. The first Soviet plan, for example, managed to treble electricity production, double coal production, and turn the Soviet Union into one of the most industrialized nations in Europe. Yet despite these achievements, many academics believe the first plan was a failure. Instead of consumption rising by 2/3, it collapsed. Most of the major infrastructure projects were not finished in the magic 5-year period. Whilst nominal national income did double, real incomes remained pretty flat. But perhaps the biggest failure was the high human cost, due to things like the forced labour, deportations, or the famine of the 1930s, a consequence of the rush to industrialise and collectivise agriculture. A key observation across all 5-year plans, which anyone at the time would have noticed, was the sharp decline in both the amount and quality of consumer goods. You see, a big challenge with adopting command-style 5-year plans is that you need to anticipate the needs and wants of the populace on every level. This is a truly enormous task, which in a world of imperfect information and even less perfect central planners, is virtually impossible. In free market economies, the solution to this problem is price signaling, where price acts as a signal to producers to provide more or less of a particular good. Increasing demand leads to rising prices, which leads to more supply, which meets demand, and so on. Now, this is not to say that any economy is in the purest sense a free market with unfettered capitalism. Take for example the UK's NHS, transportation in many free market economies, or utility pricing. But the point is, if your economy centres around a 5-year plan, it takes the control dial and cranks it up to the extreme. Resources, especially for major industries, are directed by administrative decrees, not markets or prices. Now herein lies an important point. Some believe that the role of the planned economy was to replicate the market equilibrium, but without the mistakes which befell the market, like business cycles, unemployment, or the efficient allocation of resources. All nice in theory, but extremely hard to achieve in practice. Now speaking of practice, how exactly were plans carried out? If we were to use the Soviet Union as a model, which many other countries' plans were based off, the plans were directed at the top level by Gosplan, the State Planning Commission. According to the Federation of American Scientists, Gosplan combined the broad economic goals set forth by the Council of Ministers with data supplied by lower administrative levels regarding the current state of the economy. The plan outlined major aspects of economic activity in each sector and region. To achieve internally consistent plans, Gosplan used a method called the system of material balances. The system consisted of preparing balance sheets where material, labour and financial resources were listed as assets, and plan requirements as liabilities. The task called for planners to balance resources and requirements to ensure that all the necessary inputs were provided for the planned output. Given the ridiculous amount of planning entailed, Gosplan's focus was very much on key sectors of the economy. The plan for non-core sectors was really only developed to the extent needed to ensure achievement of the main goals, which makes sense if you're only being judged against big-ticket items. As Gosplan's focus was at the high level, individual enterprises at the base of the planning pyramid were called upon to develop the most detailed plans covering all aspects of their operations. This is where the flow of information was reversed, from top down to bottom up. According to Soviet reports at the time, approximately 110 million citizens played a part in discussions of the draft guidelines for the 1986-90 plan and longer-term planning for the 1986-2000 period. After being passed up the planning hierarchy, intensive bargaining would occur between the workers, managers and planners, with authorities pressing for higher and often unrealistic targets, whilst workers would push back for targets they could fulfill, and in many cases, overfulfill. Ultimately, this intensive negotiation style, occurring across the whole Union, would be revised and amended by the highest levels of Soviet authority before filtering back down again. So what were the problems with the 5-year plans? As you can imagine, this whole process was fraught with problems. The plans themselves ended up being quite fluid, undergoing continual revisions when results were predictable or already known. Commentators of the topic have noted that Soviet records of targets being met tended to rise over the 5-year period. Now, this is hardly surprising, as firstly, planners adjusted their expectations to results. Secondly, plans remained negotiable, so producers could often bargain targets down during drafting. And finally, if the other two methods failed, producers could always just fulfill plans for output by manipulating prices upwards. As a result, hidden inflation became a persistent phenomenon. Such problems go a long way to explaining why command-planned economies tended to have lower living standards. As with all systems, there are always going to be those who game the system, with planned economies being the perfect environment for this. For any command economy planner, a key issue is setting targets without knowing what industry is really capable of producing. Soviet producers actually went to great lengths to conceal their true production from planners in the hope of receiving an easier plan. The standard Soviet solution to this issue was to base future targets on an achieved level plus an increment to allow for increased productivity and economic growth. However, when dealing with an economy, a system which relies on previous output plus an increment is extremely rigid and inhibits structural change. Moreover, if future targets were to be determined by current output, this created a hugely perverse incentive to limit output today for an easier tomorrow. After all, there's no point working hard today if you'll just have to maintain that output plus a little bit extra tomorrow. Commentators have pointed to these planning failures as key reasons why the Soviet Union lagged Western Europe and the US in productivity and living standards. Now, whilst this gap was actually closed somewhat during the 1950s and 60s, after that, it widened steadily. So, given all the problems planned economies faced, are they a thing of the past? Well, no. At least not if you ask people like Alibaba's Jack Ma. In a 2016 interview, he argued that previous state planners failed due to insufficient information, predicting in the next 3 decades that artificial intelligence and the sheer volume of data now available will make a planned economy possible. So overall, we've seen that whilst all economies are planned, command economies have particular traits which lend themselves towards 5-year economic plans. The earliest 5-year plans were carried out by the Soviet Union and are considered a failure in many respects. There has historically been a tendency in 5-year plans to focus solely on headline goals to the detriment of the wider economy. The Soviet Gosplan system was an example of this, focusing on flagship policies whilst leaving detailed plans on the execution to the lower levels. The failure of this planning system ultimately eroded growth rates in the Soviet Union and lowered living standards. Also, without price signals, recreating a market equilibrium is extremely difficult, though artificial intelligence offers the scope in the information age to attempt a workable planned economy in the medium term at least. As we come to the end of this video, the Alt Simplified team would like to say a big thank you for watching if you made it this far. We'd be keen to hear what your thoughts are on command economy style 5-year plans in the comments below. Do you agree with Jack Ma and think they're going to make a comeback? Or are you not convinced? As always, if you enjoyed this video, please do give us a like and consider subscribing. It really does make a difference. See you in the next video.